Hey and welcome back to Fanfic Reading. Today we are reading How It Feels by Raalm and ToxicExotic. I hope you enjoy.
Chapter 22, Dreary Day and Dreary Hearts. Ruby could feel the sadness in the air before her ears picked up the footsteps approaching the clearing. It was all around them, in the wilted grass, in the trees, on the wind. They all spoke of a sorrowful occasion, of a life taken too soon. At her side was Blake, her girlfriend, having chosen to accompany her to the burial site for an early patrol. She was grateful for it, as she herself was not looking forward to the day. Though not a very close one, Pearl was a friend. She remembered seeing her at school, remembered the few times Pearl had asked for help in handling a sword. While not Ruby's main weapon, she did know a thing or two and did try to teach her, but it was obvious the younger girl was not cut out for combat. She was an explorer who took great pleasure in finding new things, and there was barely a month that passed where the girl wouldn't have a new color running through her hair. During one of the sessions, she had expressed her deepest desire to visit Menagerie, to see the culture and explore the island, and Ruby remembered telling her that she should totally hire her for the journey when she became a huntress. It saddened her to know she would never get to find out if that would have happened, that the girl never got to live that dream. But that's life on Remnant, she thought to herself with an inward sigh at how true that statement was. Every day, people lost their lives to the Grim, or were injured, or lost loved ones. And it was her job to prevent that. It was a tough job sometimes, and one she knew she couldn't do if she allowed those thoughts to consume her. She would only bring more Grim, and put the funeral attendees in yet more danger. So closing her eyes, and taking a deep breath just as the procession began to exit the tree, Ruby pushed those thoughts to the back of her mind, and prepared for the mission that was ahead of them. At the front was Yang and their dad. The two had left early with Velvet to collect Coco from the docks, where they would then escort everyone to the clearing where the burial was to take place. With the negativity that would be emanating from the group, Ruby was glad she had sent everyone as, judging by the twig in her hair, Yang had clearly been in a fight already. Just behind them came the coffin bearers. Pearl's father, Cerulean Matt, was among them, stone-faced as he held up a corner of a coffin that was much smaller than any coffin should be. She could see the pain in his eyes, but couldn't imagine what it must feel like to carry your 15-year-old daughter's body to her grave. She hoped she would never have to. "Everything go okay?" she asked miserably as her dad and sister approached. "Some Beowulfs and Ursa," Ty replied and slipped his hands into his pockets. "Nothing we couldn't handle. Not sure how long that will last, though. Pretty sure Linda is gonna attract half of what we fight today just by herself." Yang breathed while Blake pulled the twigs from the mess of blonde hair. "Can't blame her for that, though." Ruby looked past her sister and saw the woman in question. Yang was right, she was a mess. Though she was leaning on Kelly, it looked more like she was being forcefully held up. The caramel skin that Pearl had happily inherited seemed pale and sickly, and tears already stained her face. Ruby's heart went out to the woman as she knew just how close she was to her daughter. "Then it's good we have the extra help." Blake waved to Coco and Velvet, who had just exited the woods behind the final members of the procession. The two girls walked over, both of them in their usual battle outfit. Coco's bag was slung over her shoulder, and she looked about ready to kill anything that even resembled a Grim, while Velvet's ears were folded at the tips and her camera was stowed away in its box. When they finally arrived, each slipped a hand into Yang's, and the fawness rested her head against the blonde's upper arm. "Pretty shit thing to arrive to," Coco remarked heavily. "I'm sorry about your friend." "Thanks," Ruby said, agreeing with Coco's words about the whole situation being shit. "Yang said you volunteered your team to run protection, and since we are not gonna just sit by, I guess that means me and Velves are under your command for today. Give us an order and we will follow it," Velvet said with a nod as she dug in her pocket for her scroll and held it out. With a nod of her own, Ruby loaded up her own scroll and tapped it against Velvet's to give her access to their TeamSpeak and aura levels. Once the transfer was done, she did it again with Coco and went to put hers away, only to be surprised by a third being held out. Her dad's. "Same goes for me," he said with a smile. "My weapon may still need fixing, but my fists work just fine." She stared at her dad for a couple of seconds, the thought of how weird it would be for her, a first-year huntress in training, to order around her dad, a fully licensed huntsman who was stronger than all of them put together, running through her head. However, seeing as she did have a use for him, she gave a small, appreciative smile and transferred the access to him too as he pulled out an earbud. "Been a while since I used these things," he mused. "So what's the plan?" Velvet asked. Ruby had spent the night working on it, on how best to secure the area, and she had finally settled on a simple perimeter. "You're with me," Ruby began. "We'll be patrolling the northern section. There are a bunch of weird Grimm that live there, so your adaptive combat style will be best used there." Velvet gave a nod. "Blake, you're in the east. There are a couple of biopacks that live over that way that might be attracted, and you said you prefer to fight them. I won't let a single one pass. Young, you and Coco are in the south since it's closer to the ocean and stuff might emerge there. We'll handle anything that comes out of Croak Cavern too," Yang said with a nod. "Good," Ruby breathed, knowing a strong-toed Grimm lived there. "Dad, I need you in the west. Blake and some people around town have reported the help being more active than usual lately, so I want our strongest there in case it does show up." "Got it. Keep the comms open at all time," Ruby ordered firmly. "If you're in over your head, call for help immediately. We can't risk us feeling scared and attracting more Grimm. We'll rotate clockwise to help and compensate for the unprotected areas, then go back to original positions when it's under control." "Understood," everyone said with an accepting nod. "Good," Ruby breathed with a nod, happy that everyone found her plan to be a good one. "Also, I know you may have to, but try and keep gunfire to a minimum. I don't want the people here getting more worried, and more importantly, I want Linda and Leon to bury Pearl in peace." "We'll keep the noise down where we can," Coco said and pet her bag softly. "Blunt force trauma only. Hopefully you can fix the dents afterwards if there are any, Ruby." "All right, I want to talk to Linda first, but you should get into position since things are likely gonna happen soon. As for fixing weapons afterwards, I'm your girl. That goes for everyone since I took up this mission." With the plan laid out and understood, Coco and Yang hugged Velvet before they all took off. However, Ruby wasn't done and called out again. "Coco, can we have a talk for a minute? Leader to leader?" Yang and Coco exchanged a short look, but Yang gave a thumbs up and continued on ahead. "What's up, Red?" Ruby paused, unsure how to phrase it without potentially hurting the older girl's feelings. "I just need you to make sure you'll call for help. Yang is upset and will likely try and handle too much. I'm trusting you to call if it's needed." While she couldn't see them, she knew the chocolate-brown eyes were staring into hers, clearly understanding what she was talking about. She hated to bring it up, but Ruby knew what had happened that day. She believed Coco had learned her lesson and was willing to send her with Yang because they worked well together, but that didn't mean she couldn't say something. Thankfully, a comforting smile pulled at the other team leader's lips. "Lower Karen was a hard lesson. One that I learned from," Coco replied firmly. "If we're in over our heads, I'll request help myself." "Thank you," Ruby breathed, her worries settled as she trusted Coco's word. Tapping the earpiece and putting it in her ear, Coco walked away to join Yang as they walked towards their position on the southern border. With everything out of the way, Ruby let out a deep breath and turned back to the people who were still there. Blake had yet to get into position and was digging through her pocket for something, but her dad was also still standing there. The smile on his face felt so out of place, and the intensity of his gaze was enough to make Ruby shy away a little. "WH what?" she asked him. "Nothing." She smiled with a shake of his head. "Just remembered your mom giving me orders like that. She'd be proud of you, kid. Well, I guess that nickname isn't really appropriate anymore." I don't mind," Ruby replied, not sure what else to say in return. To hear her dad say those words meant more to her than she could express. Fortunately, she didn't have to, as he pulled her into a brief hug before pulling away and taking off at a jog to his position. As she recovered from his words, she felt Blake's hand slip into her own and looked up to see her girlfriend's amber eyes gazing down at her softly. Giving her a soft smile in return to show she was okay, Ruby turned and began to make her way over to the small crowd of people, Blake following along with her as they were set up in the east. People greeted her as they walked through the crowd, many of them being people Ruby knew growing up, and Ruby waved a friendly hello back to them. However, not wanting to stick around too long so she and Blake could get into position, she motioned to Pearl's parents to indicate she was busy. They all seemed to understand and gave a simple nod, and before long, Ruby was standing in front of the grieving couple. "Hi, Mrs. Matt, Mr. Matt." "Hello, Ruby," Leon replied, the smile looking like the most forced thing in the world, as his bright blue eyes held nothing but pain. Thank you for doing this for us today, and for taking out the Grimm that took our darling girl from us. It's not a problem, she replied with a shake of her head. But we really shouldn't have to. No, you shouldn't, he agreed and wrapped an arm around his wife. Up close, she looked worse than ever. The silvery hair that Pearl had also inherited, that she normally kept in a tight bun, hung down over her black dress. It was windswept and knotted, but she didn't seem to care. The only thing she seemed to care about was gently caressing the picture of Pearl that was attached to the coffin. Linda appreciates it too. This week has been tough on her though. Tough on all of us. I can only... No, I can't, she sighed, not wanting to lie to him. What I can do is assure you that you can bury her in peace. My team has the area covered and will keep you all safe. I can see my daughter looked up to you for a reason, he said with a grateful nod. But the ceremony is about to start, and I shouldn't keep you any longer. Right, Ruby said and took a step back, only to see that Blake hadn't moved and was fiddling with something in her hand. Blah. Blake breathed, earning the attention of the man. You don't know me, but I found these while we were investigating the lake. Blake opened her hand to reveal a beaded bracelet. I fixed the band for you, and it's tradition on Menagerie to hold an item belonging to the deceased during the burial. She held out the bracelet, and Linda turned her head to look at it. Tears filled her eyes as she reached out to take in, her hands quickly closing around the accessory and clutching it to her chest. Thank you, she whispered, her voice sounding raw and cracked. Ruby saw Blake give the woman a small smile before stepping back. Taking her girlfriend's hand again, she looked up at her and mouthed a silent thank you of her own. In response, Blake pressed a light kiss on her lips before pulling away with a subtle tap on her earbud. With a final wave, she took off towards the woods, and Ruby took one last glance at the small coffin, the wooden box being much smaller than Ruby thought a coffin should ever be, and started towards her position. Velvet was waiting as she arrived, and Ruby gave her a quick nod. The forest seemed clear, but she knew that would not last long, so reaching up, she tapped the comms and turned them online. Comms check, report in. In position in the east, all seems clear for now. Same here in the west. Yang? Coco? Some mantids, but all good here, sis. All right, Ruby breathed, pulling Crescent Rose from its holster and extending it, determined to only use her bullets if it was absolutely necessary. Comms confirmed. Keep an eye on your aura levels, and let's protect this place. One life was already lost. We're not losing anyone else. Ruby was right in thinking that things would pick up pretty fast. It had barely been 3 minutes since getting into position that Grimm began to run towards the funeral gathering. Beowulfs, Ursai, creeps, mantids, termites, croakers, all manner of Grimm were making their way out of the woods. They were handling them well enough, but it was hard work. There was barely more than a minute or two where she and Velvet could rest. As such, Ruby was already breathing a little heavy, and the funeral seemed to only be halfway through. To her side, Velvet didn't seem to be as affected, but her chest was still working faster than normal. Ruby suspected that was due to the difference between a second year and a first year. The faunus was obviously already used to the endless hordes of Grimm, and Ruby was very happy she had chosen Velvet to guard the northern sector with her. Her recreation of Penny's sword, floating array, and the laser beam they made when combined had been the only thing that could destroy the termite swarm. Thankfully though, despite a few scrapes, neither of them had taken too many hits, and their aura reserves were holding fine. We should take a second to breathe, Velvet suggested, pulling her camera from its box and scrolling through the pictures. Still extremely confused as to how Velvet's weapon worked, Ruby watched over her shoulder and saw her place a few pictures into a file before pressing the copy button. Ruby didn't see what she made, but Velvet quickly pressed a finger to her ear. ADA, scan the area. She waited for a second and saw a smile appear on Velvet's face as a puff of blue issued from her ear. The area is clear for now. But it won't be for long, she sighed, leaning over to put her hands on her knees. So we should take what we can get. The voice was firm, a request more than an order. Maybe Velvet wasn't doing as well as Ruby thought. Looking up, she saw the girl place her camera back into its box and lean against a tree. Sorry, she apologized. It's fine, you're a first year. Velvet breathed deeply. You'll get used to it. I remember our first mission. We were barely able to walk at the end of the day. Even Fox was too tired to crack jokes. Wow. Really must have been rough. Ruby chuckled, knowing the only time Fox ever stopped joking around was when he was asleep. 7 hours of killing Grim, not as many as this though, Velvet said with a hum of confirmation. On such a long hunt, you learn to take breaks when you can, or you won't be useful when you're needed. Hearing the sense in Velvet's words, Ruby gave her a short nod of understanding. Slumping to the floor, she dropped Crescent Rose to the ground beneath her and spread out. Her legs immediately thanked her, and she let out a loud groan of relief. Watching Velvet take a seat too, Ruby reached up and tapped her earpiece. Hey Blake, everything okay in the east? Got it handled now, Blake replied breathlessly. You weren't kidding about the biopacks though. I think Coco got the alpha that led some around to the south. Shoved his head down into his chest. Coco interjected with a confirmation. Me and Yang are fine too. Aw, Yang not giving you enough attention? Velvet cooed into her own earpiece. I give her plenty, Yang chimed in. Damn it, another Ursa Major. Catch up later. I see some Beowulfs on the tree line too. Be safe, Ruby muttered to her team. Looking up at the sky once the comms fell silent, Ruby thought on how weird it was to fight without her team. She used to be fine fighting alone. She never had to worry about commanding anything other than her side, and the only positioning she had to maintain was hers and the Grimm's. But after almost 6 months of training alongside her teams, it felt weird to fight alongside someone who wasn't them. She was almost certain that the only reason her teamwork with Velvet was so good was because of the girl's semblance to copy fighting styles. She had been sticking mainly to Weiss, Blake, and Yang's style, and though she was close, it still felt a little off. Especially when the Faunus copied Weiss' style. That was probably because Weiss' semblance was so heavily integrated into her fighting style, and Velvet couldn't copy that. That didn't mean Weiss wasn't a fantastic fighter without it. She almost never used it in their sparring sessions, and Ruby still rarely won, though she was getting closer to making them even fights. But when she used the semblance, their teamwork seemed to flow like water. Every time Ruby needed a platform, Weiss would make it without her having to give any indication. Whenever Weiss needed to back off, Ruby was ready to take the heat for a while, until the heiress composed herself. Technique after technique had been mastered over those 6 months of training, faster than with any other member of her team, even Blake. And Ruby really missed those training sessions. More than anything though, she missed her best friend. People said the stern girl had changed during her time at Beacon, even Blake and Yang said it, but Ruby didn't think she was any different. Sure, she was a little less cranky and had relaxed her standards, but everything that made Ruby like her was still exactly the same. Weiss had a good heart. The people who said she changed were just finally seeing past the facade the heiress put up. A facade that Ruby had seen past from their first day as partners when she had been saved from the Deathstalker. Though never really engaging in the conversations, Weiss never turned her away when she wanted to talk, and unless there was studying to be done, she also never said no when Ruby wanted to goof around. Weiss really was a true friend, and to go a week with nothing but text messages had made her feel a little alone. She loved hanging out with Yang, and everything she did with Blake made her smile, but there was still a feeling that their team was incomplete whenever they all sat down for a meal. She really hoped the girl could return soon, and that incomplete feeling would vanish with. I hear movement, Velvet said, cutting through Ruby's thoughts and causing her to sit up. Where? Coming towards us from the clearing. Velvet's ears twisted in the direction the funeral was taking place. Sounds like footsteps. Do you want me to check? Nah, you're better off here, Ruby sighed, lifting to her feet and brushing the dirt from her skirt. I'll see who it is. She picked up Crescent Rose from the ground and walked towards the direction Velvet's ears had turned. Weaving through the trees, Ruby saw the clearing ahead and all the people there. It looked like a teacher from Signal was standing in front of the crowd and speaking, though he was too far away to hear. Scanning the crowd, she saw 2 people walking towards her that she vaguely recognized and noticed a worried look on their face as they scanned the treeline. She turned in place for whatever they were looking for and saw it a couple of trees away. A leg stuck out from behind the trunk, the knee bent to show its owner was sitting down. With the size, Ruby assumed the owner was young and quickly marked where she was. Putting a comforting smile on her face, she took a step out of the woods and waved to get the parents' attention. Once she had it, she held out her hand to tell them to stay and motioned to where she had seen the leg and then to herself. Understanding her request for them to not enter the forest, they gave a nod and backed away, though not by far. Returning it, Ruby ducked back into the trees and moved to see who the leg belonged to. She heard the gentle crying before she saw the owner, a girl who looked roughly a year younger than herself. Her pale blonde hair was in a neat ponytail, and pale skin stood out against her black dress. Ruby recognized her from Signal. "Hey," she said softly as she approached, startling the girl a little. "RWBY, right?" The girl gave a small nod and a sniffle. "Mind if I sit down? All this fighting is kind of tiring." The girl gave another nod, and Ruby took a seat at the base of the opposite tree. She stayed quiet for a little while, letting the girl feel her emotions. A minute or two passed, and the girl finally stopped crying, but her head was still kept firmly in her knees. "Ruby," she heard Velvet's voice say in her ear. "I have some grim here that could be tricky alone." Not wanting to leave the girl, nor usher her back to her parents when she clearly wasn't ready, Ruby raised her hand to her ear to reply. "I have something here. Blake, can you circle around to help Velvet?" "Sure, but the Biopack are waiting." "I can cover your position for now," Yang replied. "Coco has things handled here." "All right. On my way, Velvet." Dropping her hand, she crossed her legs and looked back to RWBY to see that the orders had clearly sparked her interest. Her head finally left her knees, and Ruby could see the pink eyes looking at her, the skin around them an equal shade of pink from her earlier crying. Ruby offered her the same comforting smile she had given the parents and leaned her side against the tree. "Why you don't have to STI for me?" The girl coughed and wiped her eyes. "I want to." Ruby smiled and reached into her back pouch to pull out 2 energy bars and handed one to her. "They're not as good as chocolate, but they still taste all right." RWBY eyed it for a second, but eventually reached out a shaky hand to take it. "Thanks," she mumbled softly. Silence filled the space again as they both unwrapped the snack, and though the blonde's trembling fingers caused it to take a couple of tries, she eventually got it and took a bite. Ruby wasn't surprised at the grimace, as in truth they were rather bland. "Were you friends?" She asked the question cautiously, not wanting to upset her further. Thankfully it seemed okay, and the girl had another nod. "We were friends." Ruby picked up on the pause. "Oh," she breathed. "I'm sorry. I was still getting to know her." RWBY stuttered, her mouth still full of food. Suddenly it clicked and, remembering what Yang had said about Peel's Pond being a dating spot, she pieced it together. "You were who she was meeting?" RWBY gave a sad nod, and her eyes returned to the ground. "But I was stupid. I got detention, and when I showed up and couldn't find her, I thought she went home and was mad at me because she wasn't returning my texts. I didn't realize something might have happened until she didn't come to school the next day. If I was you would have died too." Ruby kept her voice firm and steady. It hurt her to be so callous, but she knew it was something she needed to make sure RWBY understood. "How do you would have died too," Ruby repeated a little softer as she reached out to place a hand on the girl's knee. "RWBY, I fought that thing with my sister, and it was a struggle. There's nothing you could have done if you were there, and if you were then we'd be burying 2 bodies today." "Then what do I do?" the girl said miserably, tears appearing in her eyes again. "If I can't even protect my friends? Ruby was about to reply, but an alerted voice sounded in her ear. "Ruby! 2 got through and are headed straight at you." She saw them before Blake's words were even finished. 2 knee-high Grims sprinting full speed at them, faster than even Yang's bike could go. Gums. Small geese Grim whose bodies were covered in black feathers, and their armored beaks making for sharp little spears. While not particularly dangerous, their speed was fast enough to rival her own. "Get down!" Ruby shouted as she sprang to her feet and shouldered RWBY out of the way, rolling backwards herself as one of the gums jammed its sharp beak into the wood. As she straightened up, she grabbed Crescent Rose and brought it up in a clean arc that separated the Grim's head from its body. Spinning around, she didn't have time to reposition her scythe, so smacked the second with a hook and sent it spinning into a tree. It twisted grotesquely in mid-air and landed with its webbed feet against the trunk before launching itself off like a bullet. That time she was ready, and as its beak opened, she swung her scythe horizontally. The blade slipped between the beak and sliced it cleanly in two. "Any others?" she asked her team immediately. "No, sorry. The flock was a big one." Ruby breathed out a sigh of relief and turned around to see Whitey looking up at her from the ground, her eyes wide. There was shock in them, but also awe. Unfortunately, though Ruby would have liked to talk to her a little more, she knew she had to get back to Velvet since they needed to get back into position quickly. So she offered the girl a hand and pulled her to her feet. "I don't have all the answers, but I think the first thing you should do," Ruby sighed while Whitey brushed herself off, "is stop doing whatever it is that you did to get detention. Then if you really want to learn how to protect people, you still have time to learn how to do that. Train to be a huntress, a doctor, anything that helps people. And then, maybe one day, you can save me like I just saved you." She gave the girl a soft smile. If Pearl liked you, then she obviously saw something special. Whitey looked at her for a couple of seconds, her pink eyes still full of sadness, but Ruby was glad to see some determination behind them. She had no idea where the determination would lead the girl, but, as she turned and walked back out to her parents, Ruby hoped it would be somewhere good. Once the couple pulled her into a hug, Ruby let out a sigh of relief and told Blake she was on her way back. "Well, this has probably been the shittiest day I've had in a while." Yang groaned as she fell onto the couch and pulled Velvet onto her lap to bury her face in the girl's shoulder. Coco sat down beside her and took her hand. Blake sat down on the opposite end and also let out a groan. While the mission had not been anywhere as long as the Mountain Glen mission, there had been so many more grim, and both her legs and arms were tired. It had been nothing but Beowulf after Beowulf, enough to make her question just how many could be on the island, or at least question once again where they came from. No one really knew. All they knew was that some ancient Grimm could spawn them, but where those Grimm came from was still a mystery. "It'll get better," Coco said in a voice that Blake knew was reserved for Velvet and Yang alone. "Yeah," confirmed Velvet and wrapped an arm around the blonde's neck as she turned to Blake. "How is Ruby doing?" Blake turned her ears to the room that Ruby had wandered off to be alone the second they got back. She wanted to follow, but she knew Ruby needed a minute to herself. As she listened, she felt her eyes drop to the floor as her ears picked up the sound of sniffling, the kind that usually accompany crying. "I think she's finally letting out what she put aside for the mission," Blake sighed. "Maybe I should go and see her." "Leave her," Yang muttered into Velvet's shoulder, the words causing all of their eyes to look at her. Watching her partner curiously since Yang had never been one to leave Ruby alone when she was down, she saw the blonde dig into her pocket and pull out her scroll. In seconds, the television turned on and Yang's device connected to it to show that she was calling Weiss. A while passed and Blake almost thought that the heiress wasn't going to answer, but on the final ring, the call connected and Weiss appeared on the screen. She looked tired and was still laying in bed. "You better have a damn good reason for calling me at 5 in the..." The annoyance in her voice cut off as her tired blue eyes scanned the room, landing on Yang. "What happened?" "We just got back from a funeral," Blake breathed. Weiss' eyes darted to her and widening slightly. "One of Yang and Ruby's old school friends." "Oh," Weiss replied, a hint of relief in her voice. "And I am guessing she has locked herself in her room?" Everyone in the room gave a short nod of their head. "Very well, I will talk to her. I will also be returning on Monday." "Your father gave you permission?" "No, but I will not be taking no for an answer," Weiss replied bitterly to Blake's question. "This city is not where I should be." With an understanding nod, Blake saw Weiss shift from her position and go to hang up the phone, but something stopped her. From the other end of the couch, with her head still buried in her girlfriend's neck, Yang whispered a quiet, "Thank you." Weiss looked at her, clearly having heard the word due to the scroll being so close, and closed her eyes, and shook her head before hanging up. Blake looked at her teammate and felt her heart ache. She had lost a friend, and she couldn't comfort her sister because she herself was upset. Both of those things were incredibly important to her, and Blake knew just how much she must be hurting. Thankfully, she knew the sisters were also quick to bounce back, and though it would take a couple of days till their sadness passed, Blake was going to help however she could, even if it was only in small ways. So standing from her chair, she walked to the kitchen and put the kettle on to make everyone some hot chocolate. Chapter 23. Hot and Cold. Things had been pretty quiet over the past 3 days. Other than a couple of minor grim attacks, there really hadn't been much trouble. Blake suspected that was mostly due to Ruby's father, Ty. The man was always awake and out of the house hours before anyone awoke, and the one time she had watched him leave, she had seen him dispatch the few creatures in the garden with frightening efficiency. He had taken out 3 Beowulfs and an Ursa in a matter of seconds with barely any effort and without drawing his weapon. From what she had seen in his training during the day, and from the one time Yang had decided to pick a fight with him, he was much like Rin in that he was very proficient with aura techniques. Blake had seen Ty literally send an aura copy of himself to deliver a punch to his daughter's gut that sent her flying, and she was pretty sure that wasn't his semblance. Not that she had any idea what that was either. With Ty handling the Grim, they had actually been able to relax properly for what felt like the first time all week. It had taken a little time for the sisters to cheer up. In fact, they had spent most of the day following the funeral away from the house together, but they seemed to have started to bounce back from losing a friend. To anyone who wasn't a huntress, it might have seemed cold that it only took 2 days, but Blake knew it was because the girls felt they needed to, if they were to continue their work. After the sisters had returned from their trip though, Ruby had clearly been trying to spend a little more time with her. It was something Blake was never going to complain about. Blake? Huh? Blake looked up at her girlfriend, the silver eyes gazing at her curiously. Sorry, zoned out. What do you want? Hit me, Ruby replied uncertainly. She placed a card face up on Ruby's others, the bright red 7 making the girl's total add up to 25. A quiet, "Aw man," escaped the girl's lips, and Blake felt a smile pull at her own. They had been sitting on Ruby's bed for the last hour and a half, and Blake had been trying to teach her how to play blackjack. While she had picked up the basic rules rather quickly, as Blake had decided against teaching her how to split just yet, the Reaper still struggled with what number she should hit on or not. The less players there are, the lower you can stay, Blake chuckled and scooped up the cards. Since there are going to be more high cards in the deck. Gotcha, Ruby said with an eager nod as she dealt out the cards again. Hey, Rubes, said a voice from the hallway. Dad's going to the shop. You want anything? Cookies, Ruby replied before Yang was even in sight. Oh, and some soda. Kay, you want anything, BL? Yang's work stopped as her fuzzy head of blonde hair appeared in the doorway. Her eyes flickered between them, sat cross-legged on the bed, and the cards in Blake's hands, and a mischievous grin spread from ear to ear. What you two doing? She said in a suggestive tone. Blake is teaching me how to play blackjack, Ruby replied, clearly oblivious to Yang's tone and smile as she was looking intently at her cards, which added up to 14. Oh really? Blake heard the quiet chuckle that left her partner's throat. Betting anything interesting? Nope, she replied coolly, determined not to let Ruby get teased and have the peaceful mood broken. Just teaching her. And can you ask Ty to pick me up some of those Scampy chips, please? With a purposely side eye to the blonde that seemed to be understood, Yang let out a sigh and Blake heard her mutter the words. No fun. Grinning to herself, she thought it was over, but Yang's next words as she left confused her a little. Anyway, it's a little cold in here too, so I'm turning the heat on. It confused her because Yang was always warm. Even when it was raining outside, the blonde would be out in her tank top training. The same was true for Coco. Putting it aside as something the blonde was likely doing for Velvet, Blake returned to the game with a shake of her head. Looking at her own cards, she saw that she had 17, and knew Ruby would likely ask for another card. Sure enough, Ruby asked for another, and Blake placed a 6 on the pile. Giving one to herself, she was lucky enough to get a 4, and Ruby let out a loud groan. That was totally unfair. I got lucky. Blake chuckled honestly and pulled the cards back in. You? You're doing the counting cards thing, Ruby said accusingly. Her silver eyes squinted suspiciously, but with no real belief behind them. I mean, I do know how to, Blake admitted, having been taught by Ilya, who was a master at subterfuge. But I promise I'm not. Here, she shuffled the deck with a smile at her girlfriend. See, now I don't know what is where. The Reaper hummed playfully. I'll believe you, for now. Blake grinned at the girl and dealt the cards out again. It was nice just relaxing and doing something mindless for a while. So often their lives was training and fighting, a seemingly never-ending rotation that left very little time between the coursework and classes and missions. Even on patch, they had been on edge due to the constant grim attacks. That had been her life before Beacon 2. So to just sit on the bed and blow off some steam, like an average teenager, was an experience she had learned to enjoy in the months since leaving her former colleagues. The fact that RWBY was who she was spending her time with now just made those moments all the better. As time passed and more hands were dealt, the girl was slowly getting better. She was making better calls in regards to when she should stay or when she should hit, and Blake even began to teach her how to split, though the first time she had done it, she'd failed to tell the girl beforehand and got accused of cheating. It had been fun watching RWBY bumble over the mistake, the girl as cute as ever, and though she had thought the heat was simply from laughing at her girlfriend's blush. She quickly realized though from the thin sweat on RWBY's brow that the heating yang had turned on had finally started to warm the house, and Blake sat in her jacket, quickly began to start sweltering. RWBY hummed, staring at her 3 cards for a couple of seconds and deciding if it was worth it to hit on 16 when Blake had 19. Hit me! Blake laid down the card and let out a ground as she saw it was a 5. 21! The girl cried victoriously. You haven't won yet, she smirked. She knew it was risky to draw again, and she really should have just let the game end so she could take her jacket off to cool down a little, but she wanted to keep her winning streak. Unfortunately, her luck had run out, and the card she laid down was Queen. No more winning streak for you, RWBY said happily and punched the air as she stuck out her tongue. Lasted a while though, but you won fair and square. She chuckled at RWBY's excitement for having won a single hand. However, since the hand was over, Blake could finally remove her jacket. Her only intention had been to cool off a little due to the heat of the room, and she had completely failed to consider the connotations of doing it at that specific moment. So as she pulled her zipper down and pulled the jacket over her shoulders, she heard a squeal and looked up to see RWBY blushing a bright red and hiding her eyes with her cloak. What were you doing? The realization clicked immediately, and Blake felt her cheeks flush. RWBY had just won a hand, her first hand, and Blake had chosen that moment to remove an article of clothing. Obviously the red-headed Reaper had gotten the wrong impression, and the mere fact that RWBY thought Blake would reward her winning a hand with the discarding of clothes was something she needed a second to process. However, once Blake did, she decided that it was something she should quickly set about correcting. Even if she did think the flustering was incredibly cute. That was... Blake let out a sigh and rolled her eyes at her own inability to vocalize such an easy clarification. I was just hot. Oh. RWBY breathed shyly, slowly letting the sides of her cloak drop to reveal her extremely pink cheeks. Sorry. It's fine, Blake said with a sigh of relief as she reached out to take the cards back. As she shuffled them again, she felt curiosity burn within her and had to ask. Did you really think I would do that? No. Maybe I'm just hot too. RWBY chuckled nervously and wiped away the sweat with her forearm while detaching her cloak with her other hand and placing it aside. Even then, with 6 months of knowing her, seeing RWBY without her cloak was still a weird sight. Nevertheless, Blake dealt the cards out again, and they both quickly put the incident behind them. However, even after a couple of hands, the image of RWBY being flustered remained in her mind, and Blake found herself looking up from her cards frequently to glance at her girlfriend, except she didn't seem to be the only one. More often than not she would be met with silver eyes staring at her, and after a couple of times, the looks began to linger and cause smiles to etch themselves on her face. It took RWBY another 10 minutes to win another hand. 10 minutes of the flustered look printed into her mind, and the constant looks, and it was those things she blamed her next action on. As RWBY got excited about her win with a 19-point hand, a devilish idea came to Blake, and she suddenly put her finger into one of her purple socks and pulled it off. The effect was immediate, and RWBY's eyes shot open. The bright silver port staring at her confusingly again as her pale skin grew a fierce red. Hey, that was on purpose that time. I don't know what you're talking about. Blake grinned, enjoying just how much more RWBY was flustering. She of course wasn't going to take it too far, but she flicked the sock at the girl and gave her a wink. That seemed to be the final straw, and RWBY's face turned scarlet. You tease? She gasped, and Blake caught the very first petal with the corner of her eye. She had learned from their little food fight in the forest, and immediately prepared herself. As Ruby burst into petals and launched herself straight at her, Blake used her own semblance to push herself backwards. The only thing Ruby's hand caught was the wisp of air the shadow left behind as it dissipated, and with the dexterity born from years of training, Blake wrapped her legs around Ruby's waist as she fell back. Her hand planted itself on the floor, and she transitioned into a backwards handspring that ended with Ruby trapped beneath her knees on the floor. Gotta be faster than that, she laughed as she looked down at her girlfriend. Despite being pinned, Ruby was laughing too, her silver eyes alive and alight with joy. From her position, the girl had never looked more beautiful. Her face was still flushed from the earlier teasing, but her skin was flawless and accented the shining silver of her eyes. Her hair, while short, was splayed out around her. Strands of red-tipped hair stuck to her sweaty forehead and covered the cream floor around her, the black making it look like melted chocolate he'd been spilled everywhere. Before she knew it, her eyes were trailing downwards over the girl's supple neck, the t-shirt that had bunched up around her breasts and exposed a small portion of her stomach that was flat and toned. Her heart rate picked up as her mind quickly caught up to their precarious position. She was, by the very definition of the words, straddling and ogling her body. Those were two things they were most certainly more than their relationships was ready for, so as hard as it was to pull her eyes away, which turned out to be very hard, she gazed away and slowly rose to her feet. Though Ruby's eyes were still rather happy, she seemed to have noticed the shift in Blake's mood and slowly sat up. Sorry, Blake said, offering a hand out to help the girl to her feet. I shouldn't have teased you. Huh? Why? Ruby asked as her brow furrowed in confusion. It's not like you were going to take your top off or something. All right? And no, Blake replied and rubbed her arm. She knew she definitely wouldn't have gone that far. But wasn't it too far? I didn't mind. Ruby shrugged. I mean, she took a step forward. I know I got a little flustered, but I knew you were just playing. Blake let out a sigh of relief. As she did, Ruby wrapped her arms around her waist, and the scent of strawberries drifted up to her nose. The scent was relaxing, and Blake let herself lean into it and return the hug. I'm sorry. I'm just trying not to mess this up, she confessed. You're not. Ruby smiled up gently, her silver eyes full of happiness again. I was laughing for a reason. I guess. Blake groaned at her own stupidity. As she looked down and wrapped her arms around the Reaper, she felt a coy smile pull at her lips. Letting out a breath, she let herself just take in the girl before her and forget what had just happened, but as she was clearing her head, she saw Ruby reach up and was pleasantly surprised as a kiss was placed on her. Though they tended to be softer and more testing, she liked when Ruby initiated them, as it reassured her that she wasn't alone in wanting the affection. So after a second, she closed her eyes and let herself enjoy the feeling of Ruby's warm lips on her own. However, unlike the other times, she felt Ruby take a step backwards and pull her along. The steps were slow at first, clearly just trying to get her to follow, but once Blake showed she understood, they became a little more purposeful. It wasn't until she felt herself suddenly leaning forward that she realized that Ruby had led her to the bed and sat down. Blake was unsure at first, the position feeling a little intimate, but Ruby was still kissing her. And not just that, she was still leaning back. As much as she knew she should have, Blake couldn't find it in her to break the kiss that was sending warmth rushing through her body, and soon found herself climbing onto the bed to maintain the contact. Once again, she was technically straddling her girlfriend, but this time their hands were on each other and Blake could taste the breakfast the girl had that morning. But that position didn't last long. A pressure on her left side, where Ruby's hand was, told her that Ruby hadn't finished yet, and more than happy to let Ruby explore how she wanted, Blake obeyed and let her girlfriend guide her onto her side. She felt cold playing cards press against her back where her shirt had ridden up, but other than that, the position felt a lot more comfortable. Her reservations quickly faded, and they continued their makeout session for a little while, though never even used more than just their lips, but Blake enjoyed it all the same. However, eventually Ruby let out a contented hum and finally pulled back. Her eyes slowly opened to see Ruby smiling happily at her. See? I feel comfortable with you, Blake. If it's too far, I'll let you know. Giving the girl a short nod, Blake let her head rest against the bed and brought a hand up to run it through Ruby's hair as she gazed happily into the beautiful silver orbs. Happiness slowly overtook her at the pure serenity of the situation, and she soon found herself smiling too. "Okay," she breathed and twirled a lock of hair around her finger. Ruby gave her another smile that caused Blake's stomach to erupt into butterflies. She felt the girl's hand digging around her waist and quickly looked down to see Ruby gathering the cards. "So can we go again? Blackjack? Or making out?" Blake grinned, feeling her playfulness return a little after Ruby's reassurance. "I'm good with either." "Blackjack." Ruby chuckled, but looked up for a moment with a mischievous grin of her own. "But it would be more fun if we had something to bet." Blake replied and sat up to help Ruby collect the cards. "I'm absolutely okay with that." Once all the cards were collected, Blake made to cross her legs and prepared to deal them out. But since Ruby was still laying on her side, she quickly decided to lay back down next to her. She stuck out her tongue and pulled her legs up to remove her other sock, as wearing only one was starting to feel weird, and began to deal the cards into the small space between them. It didn't take long for them to begin enjoying the game again, and with the kisses that were given to the winner of each hand, Blake quickly found herself enjoying that feeling of being normal again. "Oi, lovebirds!" Yang yelled up the stairs, making Ruby jump a little and rip the corner of her comic book. "Come get your stuff." "Aw, damn it," Ruby pouted while pushing the torn paper back together. "I was really liking this one." "You can get Cicely to fix it when we get back to Beacon." Blake consoled her with a smile, putting her own book aside and nudging the brooding redhead off of her so that she could get up. "Her semblance is rather handy. She said she's gonna charge me next time," Ruby said dully and gave up trying to put the page back together. Struggling to suppress a smirk at the fact Ruby had convinced the kindly third year to fix her stuff so much that the older girl would start charging for it, Blake slipped off of the bed and made her way to the door. "Be back in a minute," she called back and left the room. The past 2 hours had been amazing. After the little awkwardness, the two had enjoyed themselves with the simple card game for a while, and the rule of the winner getting to kiss the other had been more than enough of an excuse for them to keep going for nearly an hour. Over that hour, the rules slowly evolved until they landed on there being a time limit of 2 seconds. With each hand they won, doubling the time. However, Ruby had gotten pretty good at her calls, and their wins were quickly evened out. Blake did cheat once though, and counted the cards for a 5-win streak that allowed her 32 seconds of blissful making out, but she would never tell Ruby that. There had been a moment where Blake had been beside herself with laughter as Ruby tried to copy her earlier teasing and slip her socks off after a win, but as she was both inexperienced and wearing knee-high socks, she had struggled a little in her attempts to be alluring. Ruby had pouted for a minute, but Blake knew she was only playing, and a couple of teasing kisses had returned the Reaper to her former mood. After that, the pretense of the game had faded away, and they'd spent a couple of minutes just cuddling and enjoying themselves, before they each decided to retrieve a book and quietly read to themselves. The time had been so nice, in fact, that even as she made her way downstairs and heard Coco laughing loudly in the front room, she missed the silence of their seclusion. "Blake, how you going?" Velvet smiled as she laid across the couch, her head on Coco's lap as the team leader ran a finger tenderly along the long rabbit ears. She'd known quite a few rabbit faunus in her time and knew that their ears were rather sensitive, so much so that they often hated them being touched. However, Velvet clearly didn't mind Coco doing it. "Yang is in the kitchen." "Fine, thanks," she replied and moved over to the other room. "Glad to finally get some rest." "I know what you mean," the girl chuckled. "Speak for yourselves," Coco scoffed. "Ty keeps stealing all my kills. I'm gonna get rusty at this rate." "Please, you're fine. Besides, I didn't hear you complaining when you were able to spend an extra hour in bed this morning." "Yeah, well, I hate mornings." "We know." Blake grinned at the girl who had once growled at them all to shut up after staying over and being woken at 9 in the morning on a Saturday. "Anyway, I'm gonna get my stuff and head back up. Later." The two girls gave a small wave and Blake continued on to the kitchen, where Yang and Ty were tossing food to each other. Over the past few days that Ty had been back, she had noticed that the two had a rather good relationship. It was rare for them to not crack jokes together whenever they were in the same room, and the two of them just exuded an easy aura around them. That friendliness didn't seem to extend to their sparring though. She had watched them practice the day before, and Tai was ruthless. She knew he was the one who trained Yang how to fight, but he made Yang seem like a novice, though Blake supposed they all were compared to him. However, that didn't mean seeing the man floor Yang with a beautifully executed roundhouse kick to the face, and then using an aura punch to force her aura into the red, wasn't a terrifying sight. "Hey, kiddo!" Tai greeted her with his nickname for all of them, and a bright smile that lit up his features. Though in his 40s, the man still looked rather young and was quite handsome. "Scampy chips are rare." He looked across from Yang to a faraway bag. "In that one, I think. Dummy here packed them." "Hey!" the blonde said indignantly. "If I let you pack them, then you would have put the eggs under the milk." "What can I say? I like my eggs scrambled." The grin on his face brought one to Blake's too. Just like with Yang and Ruby, it was very easy to relax around the man. "I didn't know you went too," she said to her partner, and moved over to the indicated bag, and saw that both hers and Ruby's stuff was inside. "Needed a walk." Yang shrugged dismissively, and motioned for the milk that was also in the same bag as the chips. Blake pulled it out and handed it to Yang, only for her to toss it over her shoulder to Tai, who caught it without looking. "What are you and Rubes doing?" "Just reading," Blake replied nonchalantly as Tai closed the fridge and threw an empty, scrunched up bag at his daughter before leaving the room. "Really? Just reading?" Yang asked disbelievingly, and looked her up and down. "Didn't realize you had to take off clothes to read. Get a little hot up there, did it?" The knowing tone in the blonde's voice solved Blake's earlier confusion about why Yang was putting the heating on, and she gave the girl an unamused look. "You did that on purpose?" "Maybe." Yang chuckled and opened a protein bar. "Thought I would spice things up a little since you two insist on staying locked up in the bedroom all day." "Well, stop. Please," Blake replied firmly, looking her partner in the eye. "I don't want Ruby making those moves because something has been done to make her more tempted. I want them to be done because that's what she knows she wants." "All right," Yang replied with her hand up in the air. "Have you at least talked about that stuff? You've seemed a little less stressed lately." "We have," she said with a nod, and pulled a bag of chips from the bag and opened them. "We have an agreement." "Which is?" "I know, none of my business," the blonde finished with a small laugh. "At least you talked though." "MHM." Blake hummed and ate a few chips, the delicious taste of scampi filling her mouth. "Speaking of talking, you and Tai are much closer than I would have thought. Especially after what you told me about growing up." "Huh?" Yang looked at her confused for a second, but the confusion quickly passed, and a smile formed on her face. "Oh yeah, that's all water under the bridge. I think beating the shit out of each other for 6 years helped us work out our issues." She shrugged. "Doesn't exactly sound like the most healthy way of doing things." "Maybe not, but it worked for us." Blake couldn't argue with that, as the two definitely seemed close. It was also true that everyone was different, and what worked for some didn't work for others, and vice versa. She was glad to know that relationship was fixed though, as she could still remember the pain in Yang's voice when she talked about the man shutting down after his wife's death. Pouring herself a glass of water, as the only issue with her fish-flavored chips was that they were a little dry, she took a small sip and let out a relieved breath. Nearly 4 hours of hanging out with Ruby had made Blake forget just how long it had been since she had a drink. "So what are you, Velv?" "Ow wow." Blake was cut off as her ears picked up a sharp noise that instantly gave her a headache. "Blake?" she heard Yang ask as she brought up an arm to cover her cat ears in an attempt to block out the sound that was growing increasingly louder. "What's Ro?" "Huh? What's the—" "Weiss is here!" The excited shout came from upstairs, immediately followed by the sound of heavy footsteps sprinting down the stairs. What sounded like a thud of 2 people colliding came from the front room, and a couple of seconds later, Ruby arrived with a wide smile on her face and a scroll in her hand. "Weiss is here!" "We heard you," Yang replied shortly, her hand coming up to point at Blake's ears. Ruby's face dropped slightly, and worry flashed across her eyes. "Tell her to hurry up and land so whatever is hurting Blake stops." "All right," Ruby replied quickly, and moved the scroll up to her ear to relay the message to Weiss, who was likely on a call with her. As the sound grew louder and Ruby frantically talked to Weiss while exiting the room, Blake and Yang followed her. Velvet was also holding her ears as they walked into the living room, and Coco had a less than pleased look on her face. Before either could say a word, they all made for the front door and exited the house. Sure enough, a shining, silver ship was approaching. Its body was thin like a javelin, and four wings protruded to keep it stable, blue banners hanging off them and streaming behind it. Blake knew it was one of the Shnee's personal airships, as she had last seen one when Winter had visited Weiss during the tournament. However, as it drew closer, the ship made a sharp right turn and began to steer away from the house. At the same time, a large white figure flew out the back and continued towards them. Despite the sound finally fading and the pain going away, Blake felt herself tense as what she recognized as a Queen Lancer flew towards them. The others noticed it too, and Coco began to unfold her handbag, only to put it away just as fast as Yang's hand came out to stop her. Sure enough, as the thing got closer, they all saw a figure standing atop it with her sword drawn. After its altitude lowered, they could clearly make out Weiss wearing the outfit Blake knew had been lovingly named Snopia. However, as it neared the ground, the giant wasp began to flicker, and nearly 8 meters off the dirt, completely disappear. Weiss barely had time to catch herself with a glyph, but she did, and after a graceful front flip, she landed perfectly on the ground in front of them wearing a smug look. "You totally fuck. What the hell was that noise?" Coco cut Yang's mockery off with a growl and stepped forward, only for Yang's hand to tighten around her wrist as the blonde gave her a firm look. "My apologies," Weiss said quickly, her smug face falling at the sight of the very obviously annoyed second year. "I had no idea my father had one of those installed in our ships. I ordered my pilot to turn away the second Ruby told me Blake was in pain." The heiress' face hardened. "And trust me when I say that I shall be reporting it to my sister the moment I have a chance. I'm sorry it hurt you too." Her crystal blue eyes flicked from Blake to Velvet, and Blake could see genuine remorse in them. Though Weiss certainly had her moments of vindictiveness, Blake knew the girl would never use such a cruel mechanism knowingly. So finally lowering her arms, as the ship was finally out of range, she gave the heiress a smile and a subtle wave. "We know that wasn't you," Velvet said, and offered the same wave. "Right, Coco?" "Why yeah," the girl said, her body having already visibly relaxed. "Sorry for overreacting." "It's fine," Weiss nodded. "It's unders. Yes." It seemed that Ruby had finally had enough of waiting for the conversation to die down. The loud squeal tore through the area, and the area was suddenly filled with red as the girl burst into petal and shot straight at the smaller girl. Clearly not surprised in the slightest, Weiss spun her sword and a faint blue barrier appeared in front of her, a barrier that Ruby slammed straight into as she was unable to stop herself in time. The Red Reaper bounced off and landed on her, but Weiss looking down at her with a raised eyebrow that was clearly an order for the girl to calm down. Blake could have said it wouldn't work, but she knew that Weiss was well aware of that fact. It was proven as the snow-haired girl gave a roll of her eyes after less than a second and the barrier faded. With a little more restraint, Ruby slammed into the girl and threw her arms around her stomach. "I missed you so much. It has only been a week, Ruby." Weiss sighed in return, though her arms came up to embrace the younger girl. "But yes, I suppose I may have missed you too. Looks like Snow Queen brought her heart with her this time." Yang chuckled as Weiss shot a glare in her direction. Sticking out her tongue, Yang let go off Coco's arm and shared a look with both her girlfriends. They clearly understood and made their way back into the house. "It really is good to see you again, though." "Thank you," Weiss replied and pulled at the back of Ruby's t-shirt, only to achieve nothing. "It's good to be back." "How was Atlas?" Blake asked. Though she was happy that Weiss was back and did really care for the girl, the two of them had never shared a particularly touchy relationship. "And what was that Lancer? You were struggling to summon a small sword just before you left." "I was not struggling to summon anything," Weiss denied heatedly, pulling at her partner's shirt again. "Summoning isn't as hard when you don't have the pressure of having to do a performance against your will. But then again, my time in Atlas was better than I expected. Winter was on leave, so I spent most of my time practicing with her. That Lancer is something that had the audacity to attack me on my way to Atlas. Seems like its last mistake." Jan grinned. "It most certainly was. But I can now use it to fly, so at least the vile thing's life had some use. I'll have mercy on JPR when we fight the next." Blake chuckled. The smug grin returned to Weiss's face at the mention of the other team. Yes, I too look forward to fighting Pyrrha again, she said deviously. Blake knew that Weiss's major goal for the year was beating the Australian, so it didn't surprise her that the heiress was eager to show off her new power. I would also like to get inside and out of this cold. I may be from Atlas, but that doesn't mean I like freezing to death. Aw, Ruby whined, the first thing she had said since embracing the girl. Can I hug you all the way there? No. At what was clearly Weiss ordering Ruby to stop hugging her, and stepped away for the heiress looking her up and down. Ruby, why are you not wearing socks out here? You will get sick. Your lips are already puffy. Blake's eyes flew open, and her cheeks warmed as she looked away from Weiss. Unfortunately, her eyes found Yang's, whose eyebrows were raised and turning to look at her sister's feet, her gaze traveling to the bare feet to the girl's back where the ever-present cloak was conspicuously missing. Her eyes darted to the ground in case Yang's returned, though she also had a small smirk painted on her lips, but Yang wasn't the only one to notice something. Really? Weiss asked, though scoffed would be a more accurate description of her reaction. I was only gone for a week. Her eyes flicked to the two girls, and she saw that Ruby had done almost the exact same as her, and Weiss was shaking her head. At least you will be less annoying in your indecision now. Anyway, this is your home, Ruby, and you have a guest. Oh, Ruby stuttered. Right. I'll show you around. The two girls walked past her, and Blake caught Weiss throw her a small smirk before disappearing through the door. Once it closed, though, Blake found herself in an awkward silence with her partner. As innocent as it had been, both of them knew that some small amount of stripping away clothes had taken place, and Blake wasn't too sure if Yang's words of being okay with them exploring further would stand. However, just as she was about to look up at her best friend and maybe apologize, she felt a hand on her shoulder, and instead looked up to find herself staring into a pair of lilac eyes that held a little regret. Sorry, Yang said before Blake could get a word out. If I made that happen a little too soon. You're right, that you two should be finding that pace on your own. Blake was slightly taken aback by the girl's words, but she quickly collected herself. You're fine, it was just a little joke anyway. Regardless, Yang breathed and let her hand drop. I'll stay out of it from now on. They both maintained eye contact for a couple of seconds, but Blake gave her a small nod and a smile. Thanks. But for what it's worth, you did help me realize I needed to talk to her. One screw-up, one good deed. Guess my karma is intact. The blonde grinned and slid her arm around Blake's shoulder as she began to walk towards the door. Rolling her eyes at her partner, though she was happy that things had worked out well there, she walked into the house, only to be met with an aghast breath from the new arrival. With a confused glance at her partner, they walked into the front room to see Weiss slowly turning in space and inspecting the walls. Where is all the Christmas stuff? She asked, her gaze landing accusingly on Yang. It's in 2 days. Yang and Ruby shared a look that said the two had obviously forgotten, and Blake didn't really blame them, as she had too. Me and Ruby are from an Australian family, Weiss, the girl replied. We never really did Christmas. We're more of a winter solstice family. It's such a shame Vale doesn't have a festival for that, Velvet said from the couch. It's one of the few things I actually like about Mistral's culture. And you didn't notice this? Weiss asked, her ire turning on to Blake. Not really. She shrugged and sat down on one of the chairs. Christmas is only really a thing in Atlas. Weiss glared at her and straightened her back as her glare turned to them each in turn. Finally, after receiving a shrug from them all, her brow furrowed and she took a deep breath. Well, it is a thing here now too, she declared. And we are all going shopping tomorrow. The whole group let out a groan, but Weiss was no longer listening. As it was very clear they would not be spending the next day relaxing, Blake let out a sigh and reached out to take Ruby's hand. Once she found it, she gave a firm tug that caused the Reaper fell into her lap and be captured by her embrace as a small giggle escaped the younger girl. If she was going to have to leave the warm house tomorrow, she was definitely going to spend as much time as she could cuddling up to her girlfriend first.
And that's all for today, thanks for coming by and hanging out. I hope to see you next time.